more than 40 days, though, and it doesn't seem like much has changed. It gets worse by the night.
Well, except that all of a sudden the momentum has shifted to the side of the Ukrainians.
I don't know. When you look at some of these cities, you wonder, though.
Major way. There's not much cities, in some cases, to go home to. It's pretty interesting, though, how the reporting is starting to jive, because about 10 days ago, we were starting to hear reports of Russian soldiers leaving the areas north of Kyiv because of radiation poisoning. We now are understanding what happened, which is they were trying to dig defensive positions around Chernobyl, got radiation poisoning, and left. That was the first indication of these withdrawals around downtown Kyiv and around the suburbs of Kyiv, the siege of Kyiv being lifted. And in its wake, we found these horrific war crimes, dozens of people, hands tied behind their backs, civilians shot by the Russian forces. And there's always this question of what's the proof? Well, now it appears as though the German intelligence agency has authenticated a tape of Russian commanders ordering these atrocities. Take a listen.
Машина проехала, не увидели там машины или техника, и 2 человека с рощи по гражданке.
Да валите всех нахуй там, ебаный в рот, блядь.
Я понял. Тут вся деревня в гражданке.
Блядь. Едет гражданская нахуй, в расход, сука, всех. Понял, нет?
Да, понял.
Своёбы, блядь.
And we have seen it time and time again. Leland, as we look, well, here, hello. As we look at that evidence, it is further evidence that Russia still denies these war crimes, these atrocities, the killing, the slaying of civilians. I want to point out just a piece of video and some really sad images that are more evidence to what is actually happening in Ukraine. This is a video from Bordyanka. It is a town just outside of the capital of Kyiv. It's about 30 or 40 or so miles, and you can see the destruction to the building. These are search teams that are sifting through this rubble. They're looking for civilians. This city suffered a devastating blow. In fact, President Zelensky said that it was significantly worse than what we saw in Bucha, which is where those atrocities took place. You saw the videos and the images, the horrible images of people's hands tied behind their back, tortured, burned. This town, Bordyanka, has also seen mass devastation. You can see the cars blown up. This was an apartment building. There is just nothing left. This is a city of about 13,000 people. It's a small community. It has already been through rough times in its history, decades and decades ago. If you saw the show last night, we talked about the famine in the 30s and 40s that wiped out millions of people. And here they are yet again having to look at what is going on and rebuild. And then it's images like this of a child's teddy bear amidst the rubble. This is a community that people live. There are several schools, secondary schools, higher education. There's a nursing home in Bordyanka. There are businesses. They have found time to thrive amidst a difficult history. And here you see a kitten that was pulled out of the rubble. They're looking for more than that, though. They're looking for survivors, Leland, in this city that has been devastated by blast after blast. And you wonder, that's just one city. We've seen Mariupol, we've seen Bucha, city after city. And when you talk about progress and changes in momentum, the Ukrainians have had a lot of it, but the Russians have left their mark, a devastating mark on so many cities just like that, Leland.
Yeah, there's no question that the Russians have really been able to destroy a lot of Ukraine. However, in terms of how the world is looking at Ukraine, it's very different. Wall Street Journal, when Russia loses the UN, evidence of Putin atrocities is stiffening support for Ukraine. And the Russians, hard to imagine, they were on the UN Human Rights Commission, but they have now been suspended from it. And it goes to the way the world is looking at Russia and Vladimir Putin, from someone to be dealt with and negotiated with to this pariah. We'll give you a sense just in terms of what we were talking about at the geography here. Obviously, this is Kyiv. It was never taken by the Russians. But these areas here were, and the areas in blue are where the Russians were and that the Ukrainians have taken back. And these are some pretty key areas. So the Russians have left here. They're back beside their border. So these supply lines for the Russians are cut. Then when you think about right in and around Kyiv, this is Bucha, right on the original line. That's where we first started seeing these atrocities. Bordyanka, where Marnie was talking about, right here. This was the very beginning of the war at Hostomel. This was the airport that the Russian air assault divisions first landed at and then they were repulsed, thanks in large part, we now know, to U.S. intelligence. That was a huge game changer in the war from the very beginning that allowed the Russians, allowed the Ukrainians, rather, to push the Russians back and to stall their advance. And that's really what set the table for what we see right now. Speaking of what we see right now, all of these forces are now coming back around and have been for about the past week or so, especially out of this area here, back down into the eastern part of Ukraine, ethnically Russian, mineral-rich, oil-rich, and largely thought to be what Vladimir Putin wants. Watch this, especially the city of Luhansk here in the east. This is where they've been fighting over since 2014 when I was there. We'll show you some of the video from in Luhansk where the fighting has been the very worst in terms of the last couple of days. And it's been intense there. This is going to be a much larger scale war. This is not going to be urban fighting in the way that we saw around Kyiv. This is going to be force on force, large columns of armor. And that's why I want to bring in Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis, Defense Priorities Senior Fellow, both in Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and twice in Afghanistan. Good to see you, as always, sir. We appreciate it. How is it going to be different fighting in, well, the maps would work. I was going to say fighting in the western part of the country through the sort of urban, suburban parts of the towns that we saw around Kyiv versus out in the east, say in Luhansk and some of these other relatively rural areas?
Yeah, you know, I spent actually several years in armored cav regiments and squadrons in Germany, actually back during the Cold War, and we had the job of patrolling the east and west border, always being ready for an armored assault to come across from the Soviet Union. And so we did all kinds of maneuvers and trainings and practices on exactly the same kind of terrain that they're getting ready to fight now, to include live fire drills. So I think I have a pretty good idea what it's going to be, and it's going to be a force-on-force situation. It's going to be really about everything that you can remember from your reels in World War II. I mean, this is where you're going to have maneuver warfare, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because Russia has certainly taken a lot of losses, a lot of casualties, but they also have more equipment to backfill it, whereas Ukraine has had less to start, and they've also had suffered a lot of losses. So what happens, though, in the Donbass is really, I think, going to determine how the war plays out.
Well, sure, and that now is where everybody's flooding the zone. We know that all the Javelin missiles that have been coming in now here into Poland through Lviv, many of them are now headed to the east. In fact, the Pentagon talked about the urgent need for them. There's a huge Ukrainian line here of about 20,000 troops or so, and right now the Russians are trying to focus in on it from three levels: up from the south, down here, and then through directly out from the east, from Luhansk and some of these other cities. This is the Ukrainian foreign minister talking about the coming battle in the Donbass, which is the eastern part of Ukraine. Okay, we don't have the sound bite. The battle for Donbass will remind you of the Second World War, much like you said, Colonel. Russia has its plan, we have ours, and the battlefield will decide the outcome. Talk to us about tactics. Talk to us about strategy. Who has the advantage? How much does U.S. intelligence that we understand is now being given to the Ukrainians help?
Yeah, this is really the most pivotal battle, and here's the potential upside for Russia, that they may have the advantage. In fact, I would say they do have the advantage right now, because they have more maneuver warfare experience, and they have more assets to conduct this with. Whereas the Ukraine folks, the real problem is they're trying to move reinforcements in from the Kiev area, and the problem is they're being interdicted all the way with Russian air power, with missiles and long-range artillery, whereas all of Russia's supplies are literally coming across the border completely untouched. So that's going to be a big advantage for them as well.
It's a great point, just to point out for our viewers how it switches. The Russian main supply depots are in here. Obviously, they have them down in Crimea. They're working right on their border. When they were trying to move supplies down here towards Kyiv, they were in Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian villages, trying to move weapons and supplies against a very unfriendly population that made for a great insurgency. How big of a role will the Switchblade drones, the Javelin missile systems, some of these other missile systems that the United Kingdom and the French are sending against the Russian tanks that they were designed to take on.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was going to go to next. Whereas Russia has lots of advantages here, this is one of the places where the javelins and the other anti-armor systems will not be as effective in this area because there's not as much constraint from buildings and things that the fighters can hide behind. Now that it's much more open terrain, and that gives the advantage to the Russian gunners who can see further and more accurately. What they need much more of, and I've been talking to a source of mine who's actually on the ground not far from Mariupol, is that they need more of these switchblades. They need more hunter-killer drones because those can be fired from miles behind the front in the safety of their own defensive positions. So that's what I think they need a lot more of, and that's probably what should scare the Russian armor.
Let's hope so. Colonel, the one thing that I'm focused on really is the supply lines and trying to get all of this weaponry into the hands of the Ukrainian army, the civilians who are fighting. We do have a moment where White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki is talking about some of the weapons that the United States is sending in to help. You keep hearing Ukraine say, we need more weapons, we need more weapons. Let's listen to that, and then we'll talk about some of the logistical challenges to make sure that they're prepared for the battle you talk about.
The United States will have or has provided 10 anti-tank systems. If you factor in contributions from allies, we're almost at 90-1. That means 1 tank, Russian tank, 10 anti-tank systems to fight them back. If you factor in contributions from allies, it's about 25-1.
So talk about the challenges that they face right now in making sure that in preparing for the battle you were talking about and making sure that the Ukrainians have the upper hand, that they get these weapons. How much of a target are these supply lines coming from the West?
Yeah, that's actually probably the most critical part of this battle is the supply lines. My friend that I told you about that's not far from Mariupol has described that it's great that they have this 92-1 ratio. That's terrific. But can it get to the front? And he was telling me that they have so few, even just rifles. He said that they had like 1 tourniquet for 20 men. They can't get medical supplies down there because the Russians are interdicting it all the way. Last week, the Russians attacked 3 trains, resupply trains that were trying to get to the front. So those take a long time to get replaced. And that's why it's really a big benefit to the Russians because they don't have those lines and Ukraine's not able to interdict them. So that's probably going to be one of the biggest factors in deciding who wins this fight.
Thanks for watching. Click the red subscribe button below so you can get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.